Okay. Welcome everyone officially. My name is Samantha Lurie. I'm one of the adult services librarians for the Northfield District Library. And tonight we are hosting a program called Evolution of Democracy with Christine Cook, who is a PhD candidate at Wayne State University. She will be defending her dissertation in September. And she spent 30 years in the military. So Memorial Day is coming up, so we want to thank her for her service. And I think I will pass it over to her. Before I do that really quickly, if you have questions during her presentation, feel free to put them into the chat box. There will be a Q&A at the end, and I can make sure that that question gets addressed. Otherwise, once everything's over and we open up for Q&A, I will allow everyone to unmute themselves and we should be able to have a conversation that way. So, okay, without further ado, I will turn it over to Christine.
Okay, my name is Christine Cook, and as Samantha was kind enough to say, I am a PhD candidate in American history from 1877 to the present, as well as world history, and I am also I have a minor in women and gender studies. So my PhD itself happens to be about women in the military during the Cold War from 1948 to 1978. But because of my interest in American history, it seemed fitting that I could talk about democracy in America. Whenever I think of democracy, I think really about the idea of voting rights, and that is really what the evolution has been during this time frame. So most of what I am going to talk about today is the evolution of voting rights in the United States. So I will go ahead and put up my slides here. There we go. All right, so as most people know, when we were before the United States, we were a series of colonies, most of whom were under Great Britain, not all of them, because we had a New Amsterdam and we had a couple of others that were kind of questionable, but most of them were actually British. And we didn't have the ability to vote, or the majority of us did not. Okay, so some people would think, okay, there was no democracy, no representation. That's kind of the whole thing. But the truth is that because of the House of Lords and the House of Commons, Great Britain did have a form of voting, but they didn't really open it up to the people who were living in the colonies at the time. So you had to either be a lord in order to be part of the House of Lords, and that meant you were somebody who was rich, wealthy, and had land, and they were the ones who were the landed gentry, and they provided what we might think of as the Senate in our country, but it was for Great Britain. And then they also had a House of Commons, and these were the people who were more middle class. Some of them were factory owners, some of them had small estates, but most of them were not working class. At the time, people in Great Britain who were working class could not vote. So it was only the people who were in the upper middle class and in the elite that had any kind of say in their government. The colonists, they might have had some people who were also landed gentry, but by and large, the people who had come over to this continent were not really thinking about, they were not necessarily the richest of the rich, right? So we had William Penn, whose father had been one of the House of Lords, but he was a Quaker and his father did not like Quakers. And so he basically said, hey, look, son, I'll give you a lot of land over in the Americas if you'll just go away. Okay. And so they gave him basically land. They said, okay, there's this Delaware River. It's a kind of short river. It's only 100 miles maybe. And anything west of the Delaware River is yours. So technically, Pennsylvania went all the way as far as the continent went, right? but eventually it was stopped by Ohio. All right. But that was not originally the idea. The original idea was a strip of land that was going to be William Penn's. So he actually had a lot of land, but he didn't really have a voting right in Great Britain. The governors who came over here to govern the various colonies, they did actually have voting rights, but they had to be there in person. Well, it's a little long to go to London from, say, Boston. So you can see that the majority of the people who might have had voting rights in the colonies really weren't able to use those voting rights. And so when they were saying that we have no representation, this was part of what they were concerned about, is that, you know, you're not really allowing colonies to have any kind of vote. Okay. And it really push came to shove when during the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, which happened in the 1740s. When that happened, it was not particularly successful for Great Britain. And then they had a lot of money that they had to spend in order to pay for that war. So they really needed to figure out how to recoup those expenses. And they figured the colonists should help because it happened on colonial land. So they taxed us with Stamp Act and Tax Acts. And these did not sit well for people who said, hey, we didn't vote for that war. We had to fight in that war, but we didn't vote for that war. We would have rather not had that war. It's kind of made things difficult here. And so they basically were deciding that they really didn't like the fact that they had no representation and they were being taxed. And so therefore, they decided that they should try to fight originally to get some representation in the House of Commons or the House of Lords. But when that didn't really succeed very well, they decided, okay, I guess we're going to have to do a revolution. All right. So once the revolution occurred and once they were lucky enough to win, then what happened? So we ended up first trying to come up with this Articles of Confederation, which was a very loose set of rules. We didn't have a president. We did have the Senate and the House of Representatives, but they didn't have much power, and it was mostly states' rights. Okay, and so you were allowed to vote if you had land. Now, we've already talked about the fact that the majority of the people who had come over here didn't necessarily have a lot of money for land. But the truth is that the people who are our founding fathers had decided, well, we don't want to have mob rule. Mob rule is when everybody has a vote and a lot of those people aren't educated, and it's just a recipe for a disaster. Okay, so what they wanted was a representational democracy where people who were in the elite, people who owned land, and people who had leadership abilities would be the people who would be voted into office, and then they would be the ones who would represent the rest of the constituents in the United States. Okay, so the Senate was supposed to be the elite of the elite, the biggest landowners, and they would be sort of like the House of Lords in the United States. And then the House of Representatives was like the House of Commons, but again, they had to have some kind of land in order to be able to vote. So the people who were allowed to vote in 1792 were white, male landowners, primarily. Now, I say primarily because actually right around that time, the big thing was you have to be a property owner. And there were some people in the United States, women who were widows, who had gotten their husband's land, who actually were eligible to vote and did vote for a few years. And then there were also people who were Black freemen who lived mostly in the Boston and Pennsylvania area, sometimes in New York. And they actually had small farms, and they therefore qualified. And for a time, they were able to vote. And the other group of people who occasionally could vote, occasionally could not vote. It depended on where they lived, and it depended on the cooperation that they had, was the indigenous peoples. Okay, so some indigenous peoples were able to vote at the very beginning, but that was not to be forever. Okay, they were really kind of part of a patriarchy. They wanted to be more of an aristocracy rather than a democracy. And part of this was because of their kind of Aristotelian Enlightenment leanings, which basically were saying that an aristocracy was a better form of government than a democracy was, right? Okay, so things started to change a little bit around 1800. And that was when, up until this point, you know, when George Washington stood for the presidency, he wasn't really elected, he stood for the presidency. And then the people who were part of the Constitutional Convention said, we want you for our president. And that was pretty much him being elected to president. And he stood for a second term. And then they would have basically made him into a king if they had had anything to say about it. But he did not think that that was the best idea. And so he stepped down voluntarily after 8 years and basically set the precedent that was only broken once with Franklin Delano Roosevelt of staying for 2 years and then leaving. Okay. And after basically after his second set of years, right, his second term, at the time there was only one party. They were the Republican Democrats. But around the time when he decided to step down, they actually started realizing they had a little bit of a problem because there were actually more than one party that was beginning to grow up. The first one, they called themselves the Federalists at first, and they really wanted to have more of a federal government that kind of provided the laws that were across the country versus just states' rules. And then there were the Democrats, who were much more of a states' rights kind of idea. So, so they started realizing that they had some significant fundamental differences of opinion here. And so when the first time that they had a party election, which happened to be for Jefferson, it was against Adams. And Adams had been the vice president of President Washington. Adams was a Federalist, Jefferson was a Democrat, or a Democratic Republican, as he called himself at the time. Okay, so the other thing that's kind of interesting about this is that at first, we didn't have parties who put a set of candidates forward with the president and the vice president. The president was one party, and the person who lost, who came in second, was the vice president. Okay, so sometimes those people did not get along very well, right? So Adams ended up having the vice president of Jefferson, which didn't go over very well. Right. But anyway, so when Jefferson actually won, which was in 1800, he was very interested in adding more people to the vote. But he still was a little bit iffy because he really was still an aristocrat. Okay. So what he wanted to do was he felt that we should get more people to own land. And the idea is everybody should be able to be a yeoman farmer. This area of the world that we have, and then of course he bought the Louisiana Purchase, which basically doubled the land space that we had. His idea was, let's give everybody 40 acres and they can be a yeoman farmer. And this is their way of becoming aristocrats in their own right. And the United States will be different because of the fact that almost everybody is elite. And then the other thing he wanted to do was he wanted to really push the idea of education, because his concept was that he didn't want to have that mob rule where the people who were uneducated were trying to make the decisions. So instead he decided, well, we're going to give everybody a free education. And his idea was now remember, not necessarily women, not necessarily Blacks, not necessarily Indigenous, but all white men should be able to go to school for 3 years. Okay. And they would learn reading, writing, and arithmetic, the 3 R's. And at the end of that time, everybody would have a basic education. Everybody would take a test. The top 10% of those people would be allowed to go to 3 more years of education. And they would be the people who would perhaps fill the government coffers, like the House of Representatives, the House of the Senate. Okay. And so they would have more government, political science, learning stuff about the people like Aristotle and Plato, and knowing your classical literature, right? And so this was, if you think about it, 6 years of education. Now imagine if we had a whole bunch of people who only had 6 years of education, right? And then another 3 years to the top 10% of those, and they were the people who would be the doctors, the lawyers, the professional classes, and the academics who would teach the next generation. All right. So his idea was free education. His idea was everybody should be able to have land. He felt that everybody should work for the virtue of the country. Everybody should be a member of the militia, and so on and so forth. He also was very significantly separation of church and state. He did not want to have the church involved at all in religion. Now, what is interesting about this is that up until this point, they were interested in, most people in the United States were interested in separation of church and state, but for the opposite reason. The church did not want the government to get involved with the church. But now he was saying, you know, what goes around comes around. We don't want the church to be involved with the government either. Okay. So he had a slightly different stance on that. Now, when it comes to Democratic Republicans versus Republican Democrats, it's really hard to tell the difference between the two of them. He considered himself to be a Democratic Republican rather than a Republican Democrat. And then you have to sit there and go, so what's the difference, right? So Republicans were a lot more about that federalist construct, right? They wanted to have more of an overarching government that would control how all of the states interacted with each other, but otherwise not get too involved. Whereas Democratic Republicans were much more interested in the concept of states' rights, okay? And then the other thing that was slightly different about them was the fact that the Democrats were interested in having more people voting, but only up to a point. Because of course, they were also the ones who had come up with the idea of the 3/5 rule, where African Americans who could not vote counted as 3/5 of a person so that they would have more people in the South and thus more representation, right? But the Republicans were much more the concept of, we would like to have more federal rules and more elite government, right? So who could vote at this point? It was beginning to change a little bit so that property was not just land. So as long as you had property and you were white and male primarily, you could vote, okay? Still mostly it was white elite landowner class, but now you had some people who, if they had a slave, that counted as property, even if they had no land. If they had a house in the city, but that was all the property they had, it counted as property, all right? And again, still, the indigenous would occasionally be able to vote. You would occasionally see the off woman occasionally who could vote. It was a little harder for Black people to vote at this point, but it was still doable. And then we had Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson he was born basically kind of on the low rung of things. Um, and he was born in Colonial Carolina, and he basically was a self-made man. So he taught himself, and back in the day when you were a lawyer, you didn't go, to law school for 3 years and then take the bar exam and whatever, right? Instead, what you would do is there were a series of books that you were supposed to know. So you would read the law. And then once you felt you were good enough to be able to know the law, then you could set out your little shingle and you could become a lawyer, right? So he was a frontier lawyer, meaning that he actually was a little bit farther out. I believe he lived in, I want to say, Kentucky eventually. And so he was basically providing the law for Kentuckians who didn't otherwise have much in the way of lawyers, right? And he was somebody who had really gotten his claim to fame because he was a general. He was actually general in the National Guard of his state, and he got involved in various Indian wars. So he was involved in the Creek War, which was a pretty significant one. And then he was in the Seminole War, which was down in Florida. And then he was also in the War of 1812. And that's what really made him into a national hero. He eventually was able to buy a bunch of land so that he suddenly became one of those land-owning white men. And he became a slave owner, and he had his own plantation. So when he got elected, he was basically elected on the idea of what he called Jacksonian Democracy, which became very, very popular in the 1830s. And the concept of the Jacksonian Democracy is property shouldn't have anything to do with it. The color of your skin should have something to do with it. And the fact that you're male should have something to do with it. And so he greatly expanded voting rights to virtually every white man over the age of 21. This was when they finally said, no women can vote. I don't care if they own property, they can't vote. This is when they said, no indigenous tribes can vote, and no blacks can vote. So this is when it both expanded and contracted at the same time. Okay. This was also the time when it really became important to be a self-made man, because as we said, the idea of land was no longer as big of an issue for a lot of these people. So they were really trying to, well, if you're an artisan and you know how to blacksmith or something like that, then you can actually succeed in the American dream by being an artisan. Or you can move out west and move those Indians away, but you can move out west, you can get your own land, and you can then set up your own farm, just like I did, right? Is what Jackson would have said. And you can become a self-made man that way. All right. So there were other ways to become self-made men, but it was definitely expanding things for how to determine how somebody could vote. Okay. And this was a really popular 19th century political philosophy at the time. And Jackson, was very against the aristocracy. He really wanted to stop that. And so in fact, he was the person who decided that the banking system that had started, that was nationally owned, because we had a second Bank of America that was owned by the federal government. He basically vetoed that bank and said, it's gone. We're not going to have that anymore. He wanted to get rid of a lot of the people in the government who were so significantly aristocratic. And this is one of the reasons why he expanded the voting so that it was to more of the common men and not so much to the aristocracy. So they didn't necessarily know what they were going to do about the difference in education that might have happened with this. But it was basically a good thing and a bad thing that it happened at the same time. So it was also around this time period that slavery became kind of the governing issue about what made you Democrat, what made you Whig or Republican, because this is when the Republicans actually started to exist. And this is also when there was a group called Whigs, and they were sort of more the traditional British style of government. So there was a Whig party in the Great British government, and they were kind of trying to reincarnate it. It only lasted for a couple of voting iterations. It never really got off the ground, partially because it was a little wishy-washy when it came to voting rights, and they tended to appease, I'm sorry, not voting rights, slavery. It tended to appease the Southern Democrats more than trying to fight against it. The Republicans were much more built on abolition, the concept of getting rid of slavery as a going concern. Not necessarily for completely altruistic reasons, but they definitely wanted to get rid of slavery. And so their party platform almost immediately started having that as part of the planks of their platform. As I was mentioning earlier, I have a tendency to try to ask questions in my lectures when I'm doing classes. And this is a point at which I would say, do you know where one of the first places where the Republican Party started? And then I would wait for people to answer. But because of the fact that this is not quite that situation, I will go ahead and tell you that Jackson was one of the first seats of the Republican Party. So they actually have signs that say home to the Republican Party. All right. So, oops, I didn't mean to do that. Hang on a minute. Sorry about that. I was trying to do that. Okay. So we're now about 1840 or so. And what ended up happening at this point was that there was a large amount of immigration that suddenly occurred. Up until this point, mostly it was people who had been here in the colonies, a couple of people who had come over in dribs and drabs. But in the 1840s, two significant things started to occur. One was that Ireland suddenly had a horrible situation on their hands. They had gone to a monoculture, mostly because Great Britain had forced it on them, but they basically only grew potatoes. And then there was a humongous blight that basically killed all the potatoes. And so they were all starving to death, especially the Irish Catholics. So they basically either needed to leave Ireland or starve to death. And so a large influx of Irish Catholics came over to the United States. They mostly settled at first in New York and in the New England area, Boston. And in fact, if you talk to them now, they'll say, well, the closest county over from Dingle, which is one of the seaside counties, is Boston, right? So basically it was a relatively short boat ride over. And as more and more came over, more and more Irish were there to meet them when they got there. What is interesting is that when the Irish first came over, they called them dark Irishmen, and they kind of thought of them as one step up from black. Okay, so this is an example of how, if you are from the United States and what they called nativist, which is kind of funny because of the fact that the true natives were the indigenous, which were the ones that they were trying to throw off the land. But if you were born in the United States, you were considered a nativist. And anybody who was new they were a bit xenophobic about, right? So if you were from Ireland, if you were from Scotland, if you were from some of the other places that were beginning to have more and more immigrants come over, and you weren't from England originally, well, you were a little questionable. And so there were kind of different levels of white to a certain extent. Now, the other thing that started happening in the late 1840s was that there were a number of countries, Germany, France, um, Austro-Hungary, a lot of the Eastern European areas that were having problems with revolutions because of the Industrial Revolution causing bad living conditions for a bunch of people who were working for other people. And so the way that they were trying to deal with it after they realized that their government was not going to do anything to help them was to move to the United States because they figured they would be able to do better there than here. So a lot of the people in this particular time, as I said, the Irish, there were also Scottish who were coming over, Germans were coming over in by the boatload, basically. And then on the western side of the country, because of the fact that they had discovered gold in California, there were a number of immigrants that were coming over from the other side. So this included people like the Chinese who came over, helped in the mines, and then eventually helped on the railroads once they started doing that. So the more people who were not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant as the way that they kind of considered it to be, or the nativists, um, the more they wanted to stop people from coming into the United States. And they were also kind of iffy about what the Jacksonian Democracy had come up with, which was, hey, if you're white and over 21, you can vote. Well, wait a minute. Does that mean the Irish who just came over here can vote? What about the Germans who can't even speak English? Can they vote? And so there was a problem, and people started trying to put the brakes on the ability for immigrants to be able to vote. And there was a group of people called the Know Nothings. It was a secret society, but it was a group of people who were specifically trying to keep um, like Catholics from being able to vote, or other people who did not agree with them or were not of the same background as they were. They were known as the Know Nothings because they basically taught people to say, you know, like if somebody asked, well, what happens in that particular party that you go to? What, you know, it's a secret society. What do you guys talk about? And you're supposed to know nothing about what they're talking about. Right. And so that's where they got their nickname. But they were basically trying to keep from extending that expanded right to vote to Irish and German particularly. Around the same time period was when groups of women and um, Black freemen started pushing for the idea to extend the vote to women, and to extend the vote, or to end slavery, or to basically do an abolition program. Okay, these two programs were really side by side with each other all the way up until 1865, when they had a big schism. We'll talk about why they had that big schism in a minute, but basically at this time they were basically hand in glove with each other, right? So the people that you see here, this is Angelina Grimke, who was famous for talking about abolition and women's rights. This is her sister Sarah, also involved in the abolition movement. They were both from, I think, from South Carolina. They were two of the very few white women from the South who were also abolitionists. This is an odd picture, but this is basically from the Seneca Falls Convention, which was put together by a group of abolitionists and suffragists, of whom Elizabeth Cady Stanton was one of the more famous. And she is the one who is talking here, not that you can necessarily tell, but that was at the Seneca Falls Convention, and the painting of the event itself. This is Sojourner Truth. who was a black freed slave. This was Frederick Douglass, who was a runaway slave who was able to emancipate himself because he remained in the North. This is Frances Harper, who was also somebody who was able to be freed. This is Ida B. Wells, who she was a little bit later in the time frame, so she was an emancipated slave after the Civil War, but heavily involved in the suffrage movement. And this is Mary Church Terrell, who also was involved a little bit later. So this was Am I Not a Woman and a Sister was one of the things that they used as kind of a logo for this, where it was showing that, you know, the Black woman had a right to freedom and had a right to voting because this person was your sister, your mom. They deserved to be able to have some kind of representation since they were being taxed. Right? So the Civil War, of course, is the next one that basically expands voting rights to a certain extent. So when they, I think it was 1863, they came up with the Emancipation Proclamation, which basically said if you are away from the South and you fight for the North, you will be a freed slave. So this was basically the end of that patriarchy, the end of the idea of only white men can vote. And it also got rid of the 3/5 rule. So suddenly the South had a lot more people who could vote. Of course, women wanted to be able to vote and wanted to be part of the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment was the one that basically was suffrage for Black men. They had been fighting up until 1865 pretty vehemently that it was supposed to be a universal suffrage amendment where both women and Black men and women should be able to be allowed to vote. But that is not what they were able to pass through. Instead, they passed the African American men were able to vote, and white women were infuriated by what ended up transpiring with the 15th Amendment. Now, the truth is that African American women felt a little bit differently because what they were sitting there saying was, at least we now have some representation, even if it's only Black men who can vote. They wanted to have some kind of representation, and they were willing to put off African American women's vote if they could at least have the men voting. So they were a little less upset about it, but this is basically what ended up creating the schism between white women in the suffrage movement and Black women in the suffrage movement. Okay, so just so we're clear, since you know, maybe you guys have your handheld pocket constitution on you, maybe you don't. The 13th Amendment was the one who basically said that people should not be slaves. And the 15th Amendment was the one who granted the right to vote to African American men. Okay. So now, who could vote? Technically, in law, in writing, it was white men over the age of 21. But we need to think about what white meant, because the Irish and the Germans were sometimes being not allowed to vote up in the North to a certain extent. And then also Black men over the age of 21 were supposed to be able to vote as well. Okay. So when you think about who's unhappy now, it's mostly the women who are unhappy. But the other issue of people who are unhappy are the white men, because now they feel like they have gotten something that used to be a privilege of theirs, and it's been taken away from them. Okay, so now we've got immigration part 2, right? So basically, whites were expanded at this point, the 1860s, 1870s, to include the Irish and the Germans who had come over in the 1840s and the 1850s. But now we had a situation where, starting in the 1870s and into all the way up through 1910 or so, we started having a huge influx of people from Eastern European areas. So we saw a lot more Italians. There had been some Italians that had come over before, but there were now a lot more Italians and a lot more people from Czechoslovakia, Hungary, the Balkans. The pogroms were bringing people who were Jewish over to the United States to try to keep from being persecuted. Polish people were coming over. A lot of them were having the same kind of problems with revolutions that Germany had been having in the 1840s, but now it had kind of moved east. These were people who they were not Anglo-Saxon in any way, shape, or form. At least people could look at the Irish and say, well, they're sort of Anglo-Saxon, even if they're not Protestant. And they could look over at the Germans and say, well, they're definitely Anglo-Saxon and maybe Protestant, maybe Catholic, but at least, you know, they have kind of the same background, same kind of look. But the people over in Czechoslovakia, for example, had what they called a swarthier look, a kind of a darker reddish tinge to their skin, at least as far as they were concerned. And so they decided that those people didn't actually count as white. The Eastern Europeans, the Jewish diaspora, revolutionaries and anarchists, that was the other problem, was that they really felt that these people did not have the same idea of democracy being the be all and end all. And then there were the language barriers. A lot of these people came over and could not speak the English for at least a generation. And to give you an example, my own grandparents on one side, great grandparents on one side, they came over and they signed their name with an X when they got married because they couldn't figure out how to write their name in the English alphabet versus the Cyrillic alphabet. And then there was Jim Crow. So let's talk a little bit about Jim Crow. The Jim Crow laws were started in the South, and it was basically right after Reconstruction. So between 1865 and 1877, with the passage of the 15th Amendment, Black men could vote. And the South was occupied by the Northern Army in order to enforce certain rules to try to reconstruct the South after the Civil War. Well, after a while, the people who were the army in the North wanted to go back home to the North. Were really tired of living in the South. And so they basically decided that they were going to go ahead and let the South continue the way they are going. They're kind of okay. Well, as soon as the occupying forces left, the white former plantation owners decided to start pushing for new rules. And some of the states passed new constitutions that basically insisted on some voting rights acts. Some of them were poll taxes and literacy tests. So the idea of a poll tax was, I'm going to charge you every 4 years to be able to eventually vote in the 4-year election. And it was a price that a white man who had property could probably be able to afford. But a Black man who was a sharecropper and didn't have a lot of his own money would not have been able to afford it. Okay, so the idea was, yeah, this means that basically because of poll taxes, we are back to Black men not being able to vote. Similarly, though, poor white men who were also sharecroppers and who also didn't have much in the way of money would have to pay the poll tax also. And then they would sit there and go, well, we can't afford it either, right? So then they came up with a grandfather clause. So you might have heard of grandfather clauses in other situations. This was actually the original grandfather clause. And the idea was you can vote if your grandfather was able to vote. So that meant that if your grandfather was a slave, you weren't going to be able to vote. But if your grandfather had been a white man who was able to vote during the Jacksonian Democracy times, then guess what? You can vote. And then there were also the literacy tests, I should say. And the idea with the literacy test is, you need to be educated to be able to vote. So we're going to make sure that you can vote. Well, I can read. Well, this did a double whammy. Number one, it made sure that people who were recent immigrants who hadn't learned English would not be able to vote either. And the other people who probably couldn't vote were people who didn't have very good education. So Blacks were sometimes thrown out with this one also. But the other people who couldn't vote or couldn't read sometimes were white men who were sharecroppers, again, with the grandfather clause. So what they would end up doing was they had different tests for different people. So, imagine it being, okay, you're a white person who probably can't write or can't read. So I'm going to give you Dr. Seuss to read. But if you're a Black person, I think I'm going to give you Aristotle. And then I'm going to ask you if you really understand Aristotle. And if you can't, well, then I'm sorry, you didn't pass the literacy test. You won't be able to vote. So this was how they were able to try to control who was voting and who wasn't. So then this brings us up to the women's suffrage movement. As I said before, it actually started in the 1840s with the Seneca Falls thing. And they had been fighting for the vote for both Blacks and for women up until 1865. From 1865 to 1920, it became much more of a white woman's movement, although Black women helped, but were a different they were not necessarily speaking to each other. They were still working for the same process, but they were not necessarily friends. And so basically, they were trying to push the division between the white middle class and Black women, and they were saying the white women were sitting there saying, "We're educated. We can pass those literacy tests. Some of us, because we're middle class, we could pay the poll taxes. So in a lot of ways, we're eligible to vote, but we just can't vote because of our gender." Okay. There was a division between the white women and the Black women. There was also a division between Northern and Southern women. And there was a big difference between the elite women and the working class women. And with that last one, especially, until they were able to bridge the gap between the elite women and the working class white women, they would not have been able to get the suffrage because there were so many more working class women. And if the working class women could be told why they should be able to vote and put their press against it, they would have an overwhelming number of people, because let's face it, 50% of the population of the United States is female, right? And so so they basically needed to get all of the working pieces together to be able to fight for the suffrage vote. There was also a difference between suffragists who were basically kind of working for incremental change, trying to get stuff legally passed state by state by state, figuring that once there was 3/4 of the states who actually had women voting in the state elections, that they would be able to push for federal elections as well. The suffragettes were much more militant, and so they were the ones who were doing the protests and trying to destroy property and going on hunger strikes in prisons and things like that. So after World War I, when they finally were able to convince Woodrow Wilson that because of the work that they had done during the war, that they should be able to vote, he was the one who put it forward, and it was passed. And then when it went to ratification out in the states, remember that 75% of all the states have to ratify for an amendment to take place. The last state to ratified it by exactly one vote. And so that was the difference between not having female suffrage and having female suffrage. So the first vote that the first election, major election that they were able to vote in after the passage of the 19th Amendment was the 1920 election. And the League of Women Voters was formed in an effort to basically try to get, all of the women who now had the vote to be able to do the vote. What is interesting, though, is that a lot of women didn't vote. And there were a lot of reasons for it. Some of it was because their husbands didn't want them to vote. And in order to keep peace in the family, they decided that they weren't going to vote. Some of them were actually, I just don't think that I should vote kind of thing. A lot of them felt that they were not educated enough in the various situations that might be voted on. So they didn't want to vote because they felt that they were uneducated. And that was why the League of Women Voters was there. They were sitting there saying, look, we can help you understand what every candidate is running for so that you'll feel like you're educated when you go into the polls. And by the way, 411.org still is a League of Women Voters program where you can contact through an app on your phone and be able to read basically about everybody who is running for election on any given year. And the Jim Crow laws were really pushing against being allowed, people being allowed to vote down in the South. So basically in 1916, 90+% of eligible voters voted. But in 1920, only about 50% of eligible voters voted. Now, some of that was because now there was suddenly a whole bunch more people who could vote. And so maybe it was still the same number of people who were voting, but it was suddenly a lot less of a percentage of the population who was voting. So that was a definite problem. And honestly, we've never come back from it. So the majority of the time we have roughly 50% of the eligible voters who are voting. Some of this is because of the fact that they just don't want to vote. And some of them, it's because they don't have the kind of access that they probably deserve to have in order to be able to vote. All right. So who counted as white now? Both men and women did, right? And working class and elite all did. And you didn't have to own property. And you also didn't have to be white in order to vote. But there was still a lot of disenfranchisement that was happening. So the impact of World War II, a lot of people would take the ability of being able to fight for this country as a way to prove that they deserved citizenship and therefore voting rights. And so a lot of people, even in World War I, but also in World War II, basically volunteered for the military, thinking that once they had fought valiantly for the cause, they could come back home and they would be able to claim the benefits and the voting rights that they felt that they deserved. So African Americans especially did this, but so did these recent people who were from Poland and from Czechoslovakia and the Jewish diaspora. A lot of them volunteered, figuring that they would be able to vote after the war. And in fact, they did. The Blacks were still having problems. They'd be able to vote to a certain extent up in the North. They were still having extreme difficulties in the South. So it eventually had to come to the point where they pushed for their civil rights enough that they were able to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 so that all Blacks should be able to access the vote. And the poll tax had to go away and the literacy test had to go away. They were no longer legal. The other thing that changed was up until this point, it was always over the age of 21 was that thing. But in Vietnam, we had a bunch of people who were being drafted and they were going over to fight in Vietnam, and they were 18 years of age. And so eventually what they said was, look, if they're 18 and old enough to fight for this country, they ought to be able to vote for this country as well. And so they determined that they needed to have the 28th Amendment, which was the one that allowed people at the age of 18 and up to vote. And so that was actually the most recent amendment ever passed, and it passed and ratified in 1971. Okay, so real quick, one of the things that I kind of touched around the edges about was Indigenous peoples. Can they vote? Can they not vote? Are they part of the United States? It's kind of a gray area, right? So basically, as I said at the beginning, some of them could vote depending on where they lived at the founding of the United States. And then during the time of Jacksonian democracy, basically they lost their ability to vote, and they lost a lot of their rights, and basically lost the ability to be citizens of the United States. In post-Civil War times, there were a lot of Indian wars as we kept pushing people into reservations and further and farther west. Ostensibly, the 15th Amendment, which gave Black men the right to vote, also gave Indigenous men the right to vote if they were over 21. But the truth is that there was still a lot of stuff keeping Indigenous peoples from being able to vote. So the Dawes Act of 1887 was kind of this assimilation act. It was the idea that if you tried to act like you were white, and if you lived in a regular house, and if you did a regular job, and if you dressed like a regular American, then you can claim your citizenship and you can vote. But if you decide to continue to do traditional Native Indigenous customs, dress in Indigenous clothing, live on the reservations, then technically you're not a citizen of the United States, and therefore you can't vote. Okay, so this had the effect of basically asking people to either determine if they were going to be tribes that were self-governing, or if they were going to be enfranchised into the United States, which kind of made them stay between a rock and a hard place. The Snyder Act of 1924 did finally give Indigenous peoples who were born in the United States full citizenship. And that still took 40 plus years for all 50 states to allow them to vote. And the amendments to the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and on have extended the enfranchisement more and more over the last 50 years. So we now come kind of up into the present day. So one thing that happened in 1995 is that there was a suit against the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And that was basically that Section 5 was under contention. And they felt that it was disenfranchising some people while enfranchising other people. And so during the rise of the conservative right and their desire to be able to keep more conservative practices going, they have been sort of trying to push against the expansion of the vote or the democracy so that it could be a little bit more in their control. In 2013, they basically struck down Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, gutted Section 5, and it was basically in a desire to disenfranchise non-whites. So what has been happening over the past few years, actually it's been happening for many years, but is continuing to cause issues with voting access, is redlining, which is basically creating segregated areas in cities, poll closures. So in other words, the polls will not remain open for times after people normally work. They'll have shorter time frames for you to be able to get to the ballot box. There's also the concern about the absentee ballots that happened in 2020. And so after the 2020 election, currently 43 states have proposals to change the access to voting, mostly limiting the access to voting. And Michigan is one of those states. So let's see. So the conclusion there then is basically the United States started out as an aristocracy. It was not really a democracy. It was representative, but only by a few people who lived here. And enfranchisement has expanded over the years, sometimes with a one step forward, two steps back kind of concept. And as eligibility has expanded, the participation level has actually retracted. And sometimes that's because of involuntary measures. And the voting rights that have been extended to so many people at this point may end up proving somewhat fragile in the long run. So I will stop now and ask if there are any questions.
Christine, there were a couple, well, there was one question and one comment while you were speaking. One comment by Cindy was literacy tests were also designed for people to fail, which I believe you touched on a little bit, but and then Suzanne had a question, were there more than two parties in 1840 to 1900?
So 1840 to 1900, the answer is yes, there were. Mostly there was the Whig Party, which started around the same time that the Jacksonian Democracy Party was in effect. And it was at the same time that the Republican Party was around. So that was three parties. But interestingly, one of the things that happened during that time frame is that we didn't have a secret ballot. That didn't come until much, much later. But what you would do when you voted is that you would go to the ballot place, you know, your ballot, what do they call it? Your precinct, right? And you would go in and there would be people on one side that were the Democrats and people in the middle who were the Whigs and people on the other side that were Republicans. And they would kind of hawk their candidates. And then you would say, which one am I going to vote for? And finally decide, okay, I'm going to go Democrat today. And you go over to the Democrat thing and they had a straight ticket. And you would mark that straight ticket and put it into their ballot box and then go have a beer because, you know, it was a special holiday whenever you had a thing like this, right? It was a big party. Okay. So the thing is, there was no such thing as secrecy. Right. And part of the problem with that is if you know how they're going to vote, can you try to pay them so that they'll vote a different way? Right. So that was part of the problem. Now, basically what happened after the Democrat and Republican Party in the 1850s kind of got established was that those two parties had the most money and they really were a big party system. So they had the Democratic National Convention and they had the Republican National Convention, and the two of them would basically raise money for their candidates. And so there were third party candidate or groups. Populist Party was a big one. The People's Party was another big one. Those were at the end of the 1890s. But they were not able to really get off the ground. Right, because they did not have that kind of money that some of the two big parties did, right? So the Bull Moose Party came about in 1912, and of course that split the vote. So Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt and Howard Taft all ran for president at the same time. Teddy Roosevelt had been the Republican candidate, but he decided that he did not agree with Taft, and so he decided to start his own Bull Moose Party, or I forget what it was really called. That's the nickname, and it stuck. And so, a third of the votes went to Roosevelt, a third of the votes went to Taft, and then with 40% of the vote, guess who won? The first Democrat since before the Civil War. So does that answer the question?
I think so. Jackie wonders what voting changes are proposed in Michigan and where do they currently stand?
I'm not 100% certain of that, but what I have heard is that a lot of it has to do with shortening the poll times and limiting the ability to do absentee ballots. They were most concerned about the Republicans, because the Republicans are the party for the state House and Senate. And they were very concerned about what happened in Detroit. And so they kind of are trying to mostly control Detroit. Detroit has a problem because, number one, they have very old machines that are often breaking. And so they have to stand in line for a long time. A lot of the people have to travel a long distance to be able to get to their precinct. And they don't necessarily have great access to transportation. So it's hard to get to the polls themselves. And so if you have a situation where they're trying to limit the amount of balloting areas, which is what happened in Georgia, then you've got a situation where it's even harder for them to get to. And then if you say, well, that one's going to close at 6 instead of 8, then you've got a situation where they can't get off of work, get over to the precinct in time to vote, right? And what's weird about it is that before the 2020 election in 2019, it was the Republican controlled Congress that voted the absentee ballot for everybody, because they figured the majority of people who vote absentee ballot are Republicans. And so that's why they voted it in. And then it suddenly backtracked on them. And so then they're like, oh, well, then we don't want the absentee ballot. So it's a little bit weird. I don't know where we stand on, I don't know if they've voted for it yet or not. I just know that we're one of the 43 states that has new stuff on the ballot. And of course, we also have the end of the gerrymandering that has happened. So I don't know about your voting district, but my voting district is shaped somewhat like a submachine gun and goes from Ann Arbor underneath Detroit and on up into Grosse Pointe or something. It's weird looking. So I'd like to see that change, but
we have a comment from Cindy who says, I believe one of the bills in Michigan legislature prevents people from providing rides to the polls.
Yeah, so that would significantly affect the Detroiters.
We have a question from Frankie. How was it that Florida's poll tax was decreed as legal? Are there other states that are trying this?
Right, so that in 2013, when the Supreme Court had a case that came against it, that gutted the portion of the Civil Rights Act that was anti-poll tax. So that's why they were able to put it into effect. And it's weird because it's a state law versus a federal law. And so they were able to kind of work through the back door with that. Are there other states that are trying this? I think so. I think this is one of the things that is happening is, I don't know what each of them are, but I know that the Georgia ones that were put into effect are really limiting to the ability to be able to vote. Mostly they're closing a lot of polling places in traditionally Black areas. They are limiting the hours. They are limiting the ability to absentee vote. And I don't know if they're doing a poll tax or not, but yeah.
I have one question personally. Can you explain what caucusing is? So I know that we don't have that, but Iowa does and a couple other states. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. And you know what? We used to have caucusing for the Democratic Party, not the Republican Party. So caucusing is a group of people who have been kind of selected as representatives. So they're sort of like elector delegates, right? So the idea is that there's only a certain number of them that can do it, and they go to various locations. Iowa's is screwy, that that's all there is to it. It used to be a straw poll, so at least they're not doing that. But they basically are there only for the primaries, and they basically select through just a small group of people who is going to be the one that they send forward. Now, what's interesting is the idea of caucusing in general is it goes back to the Constitution. If you read the Constitution, it talks about the fact that the state puts forward their primary candidate, and it's not necessarily by vote. Right. So they decided that the straw poll is what they were going to do. And originally it was the state Congress that would decide. Right. It wasn't even in the hands of the people. Right. So this is one of the things that changed in 1800 was that they actually started having people vote for it. Right. And as I said, it's only for the primary. We used to have the Democratic Party in Michigan would do a caucus and the Republican Party would not. And the reason I know this is because one time, I am just full disclosure, I'm independent, but I will declare for a primary. All right. And as of this particular time, I decided that I was going to declare as a Democrat so I could vote for the primary. Well, it turned out I want to say it was 1996. So there was no real primary for the Democrats. Clinton was going to be the candidate that they were going to put forward. But I ended up going in there because, I'm a good civic little citizen. And so I'm there and I said, okay, I'm going to vote Democrat today. And they said, the Democratic caucus isn't today. I'm like, what are you talking about? And she said, the Democratic caucus is going to be next week, and there's only a certain number of people who go to it. But it's the Republican primary. So if you'd like to vote for the Republican primary, you can. And so I said, okay, I'm declaring Republican. And I went in and voted Republican. So maybe it depends, like maybe we have the caucus when it is a candidate that is the incumbent. I don't know.
Okay, for any other people that have questions, you should be able to unmute yourself if you want to do that. You can. Otherwise, you can type into the chat and we can read it out loud. However you want to ask your question.
Maybe I answered all the questions.
Yeah. Discouraged.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me? This is Suzanne. I just want to say that I really do appreciate the League of Women Voters. I'm glad you mentioned them because they're totally neutral, right? And you can go to 411.org or leagueofwomenvoters.org, and they usually have set questions to all of the candidates on any party, and the candidates have an opportunity to respond to 2 or 3 questions every election, even if it's local school board or local township or city clerks or whatever. So I think it's nice that they're available as a good voting resource.
Yeah, I agree. And go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, as of 2020, and we'll continue doing this, but I started a Be a Voter page on the Northville Library's website. So basically there's a lot of information that I get from 411, but it's kind of like the one-stop place that you can go to get all your candidate information, as well as I make sure to have information about proposals that are going on. So you kind of know if you're a Northville or Northville Township resident, if you go to our website during any kind of election, you can kind of see everything that's going to be on your ballot. 2020 was a little intense because we do have mostly Wayne County, but we had a few Oakland counties, so there was a lot of different things on the ballot, but a ton of different information there. But yes, 411.org is a great resource. We had one question here. Will open primaries ever return?
So I would ask, maybe you can unmute what exactly you mean by open primaries, because it could be a number of things. Do you mean like when the Democrats had 24 split tickets? Oh,
Yeah,
right. So you don't
like
have to
party
declare. Is that what you're
party.
saying? I don't know. And it depends on every state. Not every state necessarily makes you declare. You might be able to say, okay, I'm going to do this, the Republican ballot or the Democratic ballot or both. I mean, in some ways, I'd kind of like to be able to vote for both the Democratic and the Republican primaries so that we can get quality ones on each side.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's something to lobby with for our state government.
I had a question sent just to me. Is voting turnout similar across the country, or are there regional variations?
Yeah, there are definitely regional variations. And the other thing that is a big variation is whether it's done by absentee ballot or in person, especially when you're in a place like, say, Wyoming, where, you could be 400 miles from the closest ballot area, right? Because they have something like, Washington, D.C. has more people than Wyoming does, right? But they're not a state. So yeah, they basically, most of them are almost 100% absentee ballot. And it is true that when you do have absentee ballot, you have a higher number of people who actually participate because it's a little easier, right? But I think that you have a situation where you're going to have more participation usually in Republican areas. You will also have more participation with people who are older because they feel more invested in the voting process. So if you have areas that are older in general, like Florida, you're going to have a bigger participation rate than you might in, say, I'm trying to think of an area that's consistently younger. Perhaps New York State. So, or California, sometimes they tend to be younger. So you might have different participation rates with that. It's interesting too that, the millennials are technically the largest eligible voter population now, but they have some of the lowest rates of turnout. And they've been trying to push that, to try to get it up so that they're being represented more. So it's Cindy Hernandez was saying something is not illegal now. That's 08.
Yeah, it was a discussion about why would it be illegal for someone to give a ride to the polls?
Because there is a rule against assisting people with voting. And so they're trying to say that that's a form of assisting people with voting and therefore influencing the vote. So that's the concern. I think it's ridiculous, but that is their why they are pushing that. Does a homeless person get to vote? if they have the ability to say they have an address, they can vote. But if they don't have an address, they usually can't vote. And so that's the problem. If they're homeless, they don't necessarily have an address. What's the future for electoral college? That is a loaded question and could probably be a whole different talk. Personally, I think it's going to remain the way it is for the foreseeable future. There are reasons why the electoral college is the way it is, because they want to be able to have at least some representation, even in areas where there aren't that many people, right? So if you look at the map, 65% of our country has 35% of the voters, and vice versa, right? And so they're trying to get some representation for the people who live in areas where they otherwise would not get any kind of representation. The problem is that it's now being used kind of as the bully pulpit, so that the minority is controlling what some things are happening in the majority run areas. So it's a problem. I personally think the best way to do it is keep the electoral college, but actually redistribute all the electoral representatives so that they are literally representing a certain number of people. And that would mean that places like New York City and Los Angeles will have a lot more electoral votes than Wyoming would. But I don't make the rules. What is an address? Oh, okay, right. So she's talking about the fact that like Standing Rock Reservation was having issues with the fact that a lot of the people who are there don't have an address, so therefore can't legally vote. They actually came up with their own way to work around that, and that is that they have a community center, and they gave everybody that address as their address, so that they could say, I live at blah, which they sort of do. It's on the reservation, and then they can vote. So I think it can't be a PO box number, but it can be a like what people use as a permanent address, right? So I know that until I got married and moved out here, even though I wasn't living with my parents, I used my old address as my permanent address because people could get me there, right? And I know that my daughter is doing the same, even though she's married, because she's in a place that she knows is not going to be permanent. Whereas this, we're going to be staying here for another 30 years probably, right? So she has an address. That means, though, that of course she either has to absentee ballot or she has to come here to vote. But yes, you can just, if somebody in the family has an address, you should be able to glom onto that one, as long as you're a citizen of the United States, and homeless people are. So
I will just say I try not to input as a Detroiter, but that is an issue for Detroiters, especially for Wayne State students. I think a lot of people don't declare where they live. I know that when I went to undergrad, I didn't declare I was living in Kalamazoo, so I wasn't voting in Kalamazoo politics. But if you live in Detroit, it's very important to be able to vote in things. And I know it's like car insurance and things like that. There's a reason not to do that. But we have all these Detroiters that are not able to vote. So in Detroit politics,
yeah, that's true. That's true. Did we get anybody else?
Oh.
Yeah, and what's interesting about the whole thing about being out of country is we have a number of people in the military who are out of country, And they tend to vote Republican. And yet, you know, here they are basically being disenfranchised by the Republicans, you know, because they're getting swept up with the same issue. So there has been those rumblings. Hopefully, you know, with a slightly different administration in there right now, that won't be a situation. But as I said, some of these rules are fragile. You know, so we always have to be protecting our own voting rights, because, you know, it kind of reminds me of the whole Nazi thing, where it's like they came for the first group of people, and I didn't say anything because I wasn't one of those people. And then they came for another group of people, and I didn't say anything because I didn't fit into that one either. And then they came for me, and there was no one to speak out for me because they were all gone, right? So we need to be paying attention to voting rights for everyone, because it's really easy to lose them. And as a woman, I can see when sometimes my own voting rights are being infringed. You know, so we need to think about that.
Can you explain why states have control over voting rights, even if we're voting in federal elections?
I wonder about that. Yeah. You know, it shouldn't be, except for the fact that, you know, they use the electoral college, you know. But I think that, you know, when it's a federal election, that's the whole point, the Constitution. If it's federal, then the states can't really get involved in it. And I think that's one of the reasons why there is the Voting Rights Act, which is a federal law, and why it's sitting there in the Senate, having been voted on for, you know, the update of it, voted on by the House of Representatives, and they can't get the Republicans to vote for it, even though I think it would be in their best interest to do so. Anyway.
Any other questions?
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yeah,
well,
having different ballots for state, local, and federal. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing, you know, I hate to bring up a political topic, but with the whole Stop the Steal, if there was a problem with the presidential election, why aren't they also looking at the fact that there could have been a problem with the state and local? You know. So, which would have been, it's like, well, wait a minute, who really did win the Senate seat?
All right, well, if we don't have any more questions, I want to say a huge thank you to Christine for this wonderful presentation, very informative. I'm very happy that all of the attendees were able to attend tonight despite the beautiful weather, and I appreciate all of that. Feel free to share this recording with other people. I will stop it now, and it will get posted on our website.